I suddenly found myself living inside the body of Mark, a character I vaguely remembered from a dramatic romance novel I'd skimmed once. His role, as I recalled, was pretty minor and mostly involved being an obstacle before meeting a rather unpleasant end. In this surprising new reality, I was apparently married to Claire Stone, a formidable CEO who, according to the story's plot, thoroughly disliked her husband. Her affections were entirely directed towards another man, Daniel, and she was actively seeking a divorce, not shying away from using intimidation to get her way. "Mark," she had stated, her voice devoid of warmth but carrying an edge of steel, "sign these divorce papers, or you will face consequences that I assure you won't appreciate." Faced with such a direct threat, I did a quick mental calculation. Divorce from a wealthy CEO likely meant a substantial settlement. Considering the alternative seemed unpleasant, I put my signature on the dotted line without much internal debate. Honestly, playing the part of the unwanted, despised husband sounded exhausting and ultimately pointless. I was more than happy to exit this particular stage. My main objective solidified instantly: secure whatever financial compensation I could get, and then build a quiet, comfortable life far away from these dramatic characters. The first moments I was truly aware in this new life were spent lying on what felt like an incredibly plush lawn, bathed in warm sunlight. The sheer size of the surrounding property was staggering, clearly indicating immense wealth. It took a few disorienting seconds to fully process that this wasn't my life just hours before. Yesterday, I was a humble street vendor trying to make ends meet. Today, I was Mark, a supporting character, seemingly dropped into the middle of his story arc. The narrative I remembered outlined a marriage of convenience between Mark and the main female protagonist, Claire Stone. Mark had supposedly harbored a deep, unrequited love for her for many years, while she remained devoted solely to Daniel, the story's male lead. The original Mark, driven by jealousy and desperation, had apparently resorted to various unpleasant schemes to try and break them up, which ultimately led to his dramatic demise, falling off a cliff, if memory served. The thought alone sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. Mark was essentially just collateral damage, a stepping stone for the main couple's eventual happiness. If I wanted to survive this unexpected transmigration, I absolutely could not follow his doomed path. Just as I was contemplating rolling over to soak up more sun, my phone buzzed insistently. It was Claire. The moment I answered, her sharp, impatient voice cut through the line. "Mark, I need you to get yourself over here immediately." Her demanding tone instantly jogged my memory regarding the plot's recent events. Just yesterday, Claire had formally requested the divorce. The original Mark, predictably, had refused and, in a fit of possessive anger, had arranged for Daniel to be kidnapped. Fortunately, Claire and her security team intervened quickly, preventing Daniel from suffering any serious harm, though he was roughed up. Now she was clearly summoning me to face her wrath. I hung up the phone, a distinct sense of panic starting to build. Hurting her precious Daniel, even if it was the original Mark's doing, meant she'd be looking for serious payback. Getting out of here seemed like the only rational course of action. I scrambled to my feet and started heading back towards the imposing main house visible in the distance. The sheer scale of the estate was almost comical. Just the walk from the lawn back to the living room left me slightly breathless and sweating under the afternoon sun. Mark and Claire, I recalled from the novel's details, maintained separate living quarters within the massive residence, and her private rooms were generally considered off-limits to him. However, my borrowed memories also included knowledge of where she kept her most valuable possessions, particularly her jewelry. The original Mark, being merely an adopted son of the somewhat less prominent Green family, was largely disregarded by them and possessed very little personal wealth. His bank account, apparently, held barely enough funds to cover a month's basic expenses. If I wanted to make a clean getaway, I needed some starting capital, and I needed it fast. Slipping cautiously into her opulent bedroom, a space that felt both luxurious and unnervingly forbidden, I quickly located her jewelry box. Inside, a stunning sapphire necklace immediately caught my eye. It looked incredibly expensive. The kind of piece that could fund a comfortable life for years. Just a few items like this would be enough. While scanning the room for anything else easily portable and valuable, my gaze fell upon a sketchbook lying open on a polished side table. Curiosity overcame my caution, and I picked it up. It was filled cover to cover with detailed sketches of Claire, meticulously drawn by Mark over many years, capturing her from her teenage days right up to the present. Each drawing was carefully dated, chronicling his unwavering, observant love for her. It was a poignant testament to the original Mark's deep and unreciprocated feelings. Yet, despite this clear devotion, his feelings meant absolutely nothing to Claire, whose heart and mind were solely focused on Daniel. I remembered a particularly painful scene described in the book. In his final moments, dangling precariously before his fatal fall, Mark had desperately begged Claire just to look at him one last time. She hadn't even granted him that small mercy, her attention already elsewhere. What an utter fool the original Mark had been, I thought with a mixture of pity and detachment, carefully placing the sketchbook back where I found it. Pocketing the sapphire necklace and a few other promising pieces, I turned to leave, my escape plan solidifying, but just as I reached the bedroom door, my heart leaped into my throat. 2 stern-looking bodyguards were purposefully striding down the corridor directly towards me. My escape route was cut off. It was too late. I was caught. Roughly half an hour later, feeling resigned, I found myself being firmly escorted into a private, soundproofed room at what looked like an extremely exclusive club. My blood ran a little colder when I saw Claire seated in the center of the room, looking every bit the regal and impossibly beautiful Ice Queen described in the novel. Her fair skin seemed almost luminous under the soft lighting. It wasn't difficult, seeing her now, to understand the original Mark's consuming obsession. Seated protectively beside her was Daniel, the male lead, possessing the kind of conventionally handsome face and earnest demeanor typical of romantic heroes, despite his supposedly troubled background. Several other individuals, presumably members of their wealthy social circle, were also present, observing my arrival with expressions ranging from detached curiosity to open amusement. Claire fixed me with an icy, penetrating stare. "Mark," she commanded, her voice low and dangerously calm. "Get on your knees right now and apologize properly to Daniel." Daniel reached out, placing a gentle hand on her arm, as if to intervene. "It's really okay, Claire," he murmured softly. But Claire wasn't moved. "No?" she snapped back, her eyes flashing. "He dared to arrange your kidnapping. He needs to understand that actions have severe consequences." I immediately understood the dynamic. She needed to see me humbled, primarily for Daniel's benefit, to reassert control and perhaps soothe his ruffled feathers. Fine. Survival was the priority here, and sometimes survival required swallowing one's pride. A smart person knows when resistance is futile. Without any hesitation that might be misinterpreted as defiance, I dropped to my knees with a soft thud on the plush carpet. Looking towards Daniel with an expression I hoped conveyed sincere regret, I said clearly, "I'm truly sorry, Daniel. Arranging for you to be kidnapped was a terrible thing to do. It won't happen again." The reaction was immediate and palpable. Not just Claire, but Daniel and everyone else in the room looked momentarily taken aback, clearly surprised by my swift and unqualified compliance. "Is there anything else you require?" Should I bow lower, perhaps? I asked, aiming for a tone of meek subservience, trying to gauge just how much groveling was expected to satisfy Claire's need for retribution. Before she could even formulate a response, I preemptively bowed my head again, briefly touching my forehead to the floor in a gesture of utmost apology. "Enough," Claire snapped, clearly not wanting to prolong the spectacle. She tossed a file folder so it landed on the carpet in front of me. Inside, I saw were the divorce papers I had signed earlier. "Sign the official copies now, Mark," she stated harshly, her earlier threat still hanging in the air. "And if you even think about causing trouble over this, I meant what I said about your legs." My gaze instinctively flickered down towards my own legs, a genuine shudder running through me at the thought. Picking up the folder, I carefully reviewed the finalized agreement inside. My eyes widened again as I reread the specific clauses regarding the settlement. Upon the divorce being legally finalized, she would transfer $200 million into an account of my choosing, and the deeds to 10 separate properties would be signed over to me. It was, frankly, an unbelievably generous package. Tears started to well up in my eyes again, an embarrassing but completely uncontrollable physical reaction to the sheer relief and the staggering amount of money involved. I wasn't trying to cry, but the sudden prospect of absolute financial freedom after my previous life was overwhelming. Seeing my tears, Claire obviously misinterpreted them as grief over the dissolution of our marriage. She frowned, her impatience growing. "Mark, don't make this difficult. If you refuse to sign—" she began, her voice taking on that sharp edge again. But before she could complete the renewed threat, I located a pen on a nearby table, quickly scribbled my signature on all the required lines, and respectfully handed the folder back to her. "When do we need to go to the registry office to make this legally binding?" I asked, managing this time to keep my voice relatively steady despite the lingering moisture in my eyes. Claire just stared at me, her expression a mixture of bewilderment and suspicion. She clearly hadn't anticipated my compliance, let alone my apparent eagerness to finalize the split. "Mark?" she asked slowly, blinking as if unsure she'd heard correctly. "You genuinely agree to this? You want the divorce?" I glanced pointedly over at Daniel, who was watching the exchange with a slightly uncomfortable expression, then looked back at Claire and let out a carefully calibrated, dramatic sigh. "Well, your actual beloved is back now, isn't he?" I said, injecting a note of weary resignation into my voice. "I'm just trying to be magnanimous here and gracefully step aside so you two can finally be together properly." Although she still seemed somewhat surprised by my cooperative attitude, Claire didn't press the issue further. For her, securing the divorce was the ultimate goal, and my unexpected willingness simplified matters considerably. We quickly agreed to meet the following morning at the designated government office to file the official paperwork. After being dismissed from the club, I couldn't stop myself from pulling out my copy of the divorce agreement again as soon as I was outside, just to stare in disbelief at the staggering number of zeros listed under the alimony section. $200 million. Back in my old life, struggling to sell questionable sausages day in and day out, I could never have dreamed of accumulating even a tiny fraction of that amount in a lifetime. And on top of the cash, 10 properties. I wouldn't even need to worry about finding a place to live. I could simply choose the most appealing one for myself and generate substantial rental income from the others. The sheer potential of it all made me feel lightheaded with excitement. Claire was certainly being generous, though I suspected that for someone from the incredibly wealthy Stone family, this sum, while life-changing for me, was probably considered little more than pocket change, a convenient price to pay for her freedom. I hadn't expected to hear from her again so soon, But just as I arrived back at the sprawling, somewhat lonely estate that had been Mark's home, my phone rang once more. "Come over to the old mansion immediately," she instructed curtly, then hung up before I could respond. I glanced at the time. It was around the dinner hour. Was she actually inviting me for a meal at the Mainstone family residence? The prospect was intriguing. For a family of their standing, the food was bound to be exceptional. Thinking primarily of a free, high-class dinner, I eagerly changed clothes and headed over. However, upon arriving at the imposing Stone family mansion, the atmosphere inside felt distinctly tense and unwelcoming, not at all conducive to a pleasant meal. Claire and Daniel were standing together somewhat awkwardly in the center of the vast, opulently decorated living room. Claire's father, the formidable Mr. Stone, sat stiffly on a large sofa, his face a mask of thunderous disapproval. It was obvious he had learned about Claire's intention to divorce me specifically for Daniel, and he was clearly furious about the situation. Daniel glanced briefly at me with a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before turning his attention back to Mr. Stone. "Uncle Stone," he began, his voice earnest but firm, "you can't force matters of the heart. Besides," he added, dropping the bombshell, "Claire is already carrying my child. We sincerely hope you can give us your blessing." What? Claire was pregnant? That specific detail definitely hadn't been part of the novel's plotline as I remembered it. Perhaps my sudden arrival as Mark had inadvertently caused ripples, altering the narrative. Or maybe Daniel was lying? Regardless, the potential complications didn't overly concern me. As long as the promised $200 million and the properties were securely mine, the rest was just background noise. Claire looked towards me, her expression complex and unreadable, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something, perhaps offer an explanation or apology. But before any words could emerge, Mr. Stone erupted. He slammed his delicate teacup down onto the marble coffee table with such force that it shattered, sending shards flying. Pointing a trembling finger at Claire, his voice thick with rage, he bellowed, "How could I have possibly raised such a shameless, disgraceful daughter?" He continued railing against her actions for quite some time, his words echoing in the high-ceilinged room. I simply stood near the entrance, maintaining a quiet, unobtrusive presence. Since I held no actual love for Claire, her actions didn't wound me personally, although on principle, as the man being cheated on, even if only technically in Mark's role, there was a certain baseline level of irritation. The utter lack of respect shown towards the original Mark throughout his marriage was palpable. But then, the image of the $200 million flashed again in my mind, and my brief annoyance evaporated, replaced by patient anticipation. After Mr. Stone finally exhausted his initial fury, he curtly ordered his household staff to escort Daniel off the premises. Despite his profound displeasure with Claire's choices and the resulting scandal, he seemed to recognize the divorce was now inevitable and reluctantly gave his tacit approval. Perhaps feeling a measure of guilt over the situation and Mark's public humiliation, or maybe just adhering to the customs of their elite circle, Mr. Stone presented me with several exquisite, undoubtedly valuable jade antiques as a form of parting gift or compensation. Playing the part of the wronged but dignified husband, I managed to summon some convincing tears, gratefully accepting the gifts and clasping his arm briefly. "Thank you, Father," I murmured sorrowfully. The next morning, Claire and I met as planned and drove to the relevant government office to begin the official divorce process. As soon as I stepped out of the car, I spotted Daniel standing conspicuously near the entrance, clearly waiting for Claire. He really couldn't bear to be separated from her, could he? He carried himself differently today, with a subtle but noticeable air of smug self-satisfaction. It was undoubtedly fueled by the belief that Claire's supposed pregnancy cemented his victory and guaranteed their future together. Ha! Let him think that. Unlike the foolishly lovesick original Mark, I had zero intention of engaging in any pathetic struggle for Claire's affections. The role of the tragic, spurned lover held absolutely no appeal for me. My singular focus remained on getting this divorce finalized, securing my massive payout, and embarking on my new, comfortable existence. Fortunately, the office wasn't overly busy that morning, and it didn't take long for our number to be called. We were ushered into a small office, presented with the forms, and given instructions. 10 minutes later, Claire and I walked back out into the lobby, both of us looking unexpectedly crestfallen. Daniel immediately hurried towards us, his expression anxious. "Claire, did you get it? Is the divorce certificate finalized?" he asked eagerly. Claire simply shook her head, looking frustrated. "No." Daniel's brow furrowed in confusion. How could that be? Did Mark suddenly change his mind? Did he refuse to sign at the last minute? I couldn't resist rolling my eyes at his immediate assumption of my duplicity. "Clearly, you've never gone through this process before, have you?" I retorted, unable to keep the sarcasm entirely out of my voice. "There's a mandatory cooling-off period nowadays, a legal requirement. We have to wait a full 30 days before we can actually come back and finalize everything." Honestly, I had only just learned about this bureaucratic hurdle myself inside the office, and it was incredibly frustrating to face yet another delay when freedom and fortune felt so close. Lost in my own annoyance, I didn't initially register the fleeting, almost evasive look that crossed Daniel's face when I casually mentioned his lack of prior divorce experience. He then reacted rather defensively, raising his voice slightly. "Of course, I've never been divorced before," he declared, perhaps a bit too vehemently. I was momentarily speechless. Why was he shouting? His marital history, or lack thereof, was completely irrelevant to me. Daniel then fixed me with a stern glare. "Mark, I'm warning you," he said pointedly. "When these 30 days are up, you'd better show up here like a man and sign the final papers. Don't even think about trying any tricks or backing out." I offered him a dismissive, cold smile. "Wouldn't dream of it," I replied smoothly, meeting his gaze. "Trust me, I want this finalized just as much as you do. Whoever fails to show up for the final signing is the dog." Hearing my callous choice of words, Claire's face flushed, and she shot me an angry look. But I couldn't care less about her reaction at this point. I just turned my back on both of them and strode out of the building, my mind already busy calculating interest accrual on $200 million over 30 days. To absolutely guarantee that the divorce proceeded without any last-minute complications, and, crucially, that I received the promised alimony and properties, I adopted a deliberate strategy during the 30-day cooling-off period. My plan was to make my presence consistently felt by Claire, subtly reminding her of my existence and thereby reinforcing her desire to be permanently rid of me. Perhaps, I reasoned, her escalating irritation could even be leveraged to extract some additional compensation. After all, the original Mark had endured years of her indifference and disrespect in the name of love. Seeking substantial material recompense now seemed entirely justifiable. Money was the goal, and more was always preferable. My calculated appearances and carefully neutral yet persistent presence worked almost too efficiently. Eventually, Claire reached her breaking point. Unable to tolerate seeing me around any longer, she confronted me one afternoon, and with a look of utter exasperation, threw a sleek, black credit card at my feet. "Just take this and get lost," she snapped, her voice tight with annoyance. "Disappear until the 30 days are up." I bent down and retrieved the card, a wide, genuine grin spreading across my face despite my best efforts to suppress it. An unlimited expense account? Perfect. "All right, message received," I replied cheerfully. consider me gone. Since the final divorce decree was still annoyingly delayed, putting a slight damper on my celebratory mood, I decided to make immediate use of my new financial tool to cheer myself up. I went straight to a high-end luxury car dealership and, after a brief perusal, drove out in a brand-new, top-of-the-line Rolls-Royce Cullinan, the epitome of ostentatious wealth. The payment was processed effortlessly, using Claire's black card. I had to grudgingly admit, while she may have been a cold and neglectful wife to the original Mark, Claire had never been miserly when it came to money. It was perhaps the single redeeming aspect of her treatment towards him. Cruising through the city streets in the massive, ultra-luxurious SUV felt incredibly satisfying. I noticed heads turning everywhere, people stopping to stare. Well, a reasonably good-looking guy driving an exceptionally expensive car. It was bound to attract attention. My next priority was ensuring I'd be around long enough to actually enjoy my impending fortune. I scheduled a comprehensive, full-body health checkup at the best private hospital in the city. Now that I was set to be fabulously wealthy, maintaining my health felt more important than ever. As I was leaving the hospital later that day, feeling reassured by a clean bill of health, I heard a familiar voice call my name, or rather, Mark's name. Mark. I looked up and saw a young woman I recognized from the novel's descriptions standing before me. It was Sarah White, the original Mark's childhood friend, who had reportedly harbored a secret, unrequited love for him for many years. Mark, however, blinded by his obsession with Claire, had consistently overlooked Sarah's feelings, a situation that naturally fostered rivalry and bitterness between the two women. Since Mark's marriage to Claire, his contact with Sarah had dwindled significantly. Looking at her now, she appeared sweet, maybe a little shy, but with an undercurrent of intelligence in her eyes. I couldn't help but shake my head internally. How could the original Mark have been so foolish as to ignore someone potentially genuine and kind right beside him? "Are you feeling all right, Mark?" Sarah asked, her expression etched with genuine concern. "Oh, I'm fine," I replied quickly, forcing a casual smile. "Just came in for a routine physical, making sure everything's in working order." I tilted my head slightly. "What brings you here?" Sarah lifted a small, nondescript pharmacy bag. "Just picking up my dad's heart medication," she explained simply. After a brief, slightly awkward pause, she continued, her tone becoming more hesitant. I heard that you and Claire are getting divorced. Is it true?" I nodded confirmation. "Yeah, it's true. Apparently," I added, deciding to use the information strategically. "She's pregnant with Daniel's child. Not much point trying to keep the marriage going under those circumstances. Wouldn't you agree?" Sarah looked momentarily stunned by the news of the pregnancy, her eyes widening slightly. Then, her expression shifted, becoming more analytical, almost suspicious, as she studied my face closely. "Mark, it really has been a while since we properly talked," she said slowly. "But you seem different somehow. You used to be so completely, fixated on Claire. It was all you ever talked about." Feeling a prickle of unease under her perceptive gaze, she was clearly sharper than I'd initially assumed. I quickly cleared my throat and tried to sound nonchalant. "Well," I improvised, shrugging casually. "After chasing someone for that many years with absolutely zero positive response, a guy eventually gets tired, you know? She can love whoever she wants. Frankly, I'm realizing I'm still young, reasonably handsome, and soon I'll have significant resources. Finding someone else who actually appreciates me shouldn't be too difficult." Sarah just kept staring, her brow slightly furrowed, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Her scrutiny made me feel increasingly guilty and exposed. I forced a dry laugh. "Anyway," I said, trying to make a quick escape, "I really need to get going. But hey, we should definitely grab a meal sometime soon. Catch up properly. She was definitely too smart for her own good. I needed to leave before she deduced that I wasn't the Mark she had known for years. With 28 long, tedious days still remaining in the mandatory cooling-off period, I dedicated myself to thoroughly enjoying the perks of my impending wealth while simultaneously preparing for my new life. I indulged in meals at Michelin-starred restaurants, went on extravagant shopping sprees for clothes and gadgets I'd never dreamed of affording, and systematically combed through the vast estate, packing up any and every item of value that wasn't physically bolted down or too large to move discreetly. My philosophy was simple. The more I could take now, the better. Anything I didn't personally need could easily be sold later for additional cash. The moment the 30-day waiting period officially concluded, I wasted no time in contacting Claire to remind her, perhaps a little too eagerly, about finalizing the divorce proceedings. When we met briefly to coordinate logistics, she frowned, observing my undisguised impatience. "Mark," she remarked slowly, tilting her head as she studied me. "Why do I get the distinct impression that you're even more anxious to get this divorce finalized than I am?" I feigned mild confusion, raising an eyebrow. Was it really so strange? What man, I reasoned silently, would willingly want to remain legally bound to a woman who had not only cheated on him, but was also allegedly carrying another man's child? Wanting a swift and clean break seemed like the most logical and normal reaction imaginable. "I'm simply thinking about practicalities, Claire," I replied smoothly, trying to sound reasonable rather than purely self-interested. "If we don't get the official paperwork sorted out quickly, think about the complications when the baby arrives. Whose name will legally go on the birth certificate? It certainly can't be mine, right? I have no intention of being listed as the father." Claire fell silent for several long seconds, her expression becoming unreadable, perhaps even a little dark. "Mark," she began, her voice quiet, but I quickly cut her off, not wanting to get drawn into any emotional discussion. "Enough," I stated firmly, maintaining a business-like tone. "Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be. The child cannot, under any circumstances, be registered under my name. I have absolutely no desire or intention to take on the role of a father at this point in my life." Her face seemed to tighten almost imperceptibly at my definitive statement. We then proceeded towards the parking lot to head to the registry office. Just as we were about to get into her car, Claire's phone rang. I couldn't overhear the conversation from where I stood, but I saw her posture stiffen, and her expression instantly turn grim and worried. After hanging up, she spun around and grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong, her face pale and etched with sudden anger. "Daniel is missing," she accused breathlessly, her eyes blazing. "Did you have something to do with it? Where did you take him this time?" Daniel was missing, again. My immediate reaction was disbelief, quickly followed by annoyance. I swiftly shook my head, forcefully denying any involvement. "It wasn't me, Claire. I haven't done anything." Predictably, Claire didn't believe my denial. "Impossible," she retorted, her voice rising. "It has to be you. You're the only one who doesn't want this divorce to happen, so you've made Daniel disappear to delay it. Mark, you are truly despicable." I genuinely wanted to curse out loud. Okay, fine. The original Mark had indeed pulled some shady stunts involving Daniel in the past, but that wasn't me. I was the new Mark, preoccupied with calculating investment returns and planning luxury vacations, not engaging in petty kidnapping plots. Still, despite my irritation at being falsely accused, a part of me genuinely hoped nothing serious had actually happened to Daniel. If he was truly hurt or in danger, Claire would undoubtedly, and perhaps irrevocably, blame me, potentially jeopardizing my alimony. "How do you even know for sure he's missing?" I asked, trying to inject a note of calm rationality into the escalating situation. Have you double-checked everything? Maybe he just forgot or got held up. Claire glared at me fiercely, clearly in no mood for rational discussion. She quickly explained that they had firm plans to meet for lunch, and she had dispatched her driver to pick him up about an hour ago. However, Daniel wasn't answering his phone, wasn't at his apartment, and couldn't be located anywhere he might usually be. His sudden, unexplained disappearance was alarming. I considered the situation for a moment. All right, take me to his apartment, I suggested decisively. Maybe we can find some clues there, figure out where he might have gone. Claire stared at me intently for several long, tense seconds, her eyes searching my face for any sign of deceit. Mark, she warned, her voice low and menacing. If I find out you are behind this, if anything has happened to Daniel because of you, I swear I will never forgive you, and you will regret it for the rest of your life. I sighed inwardly, too weary to argue further about my innocence. Finding Daniel and clearing my name was the immediate priority. At Daniel's apartment, a quick but thorough search of the main living areas revealed absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of struggle, no notes, no indication of where he might be. Could he have genuinely just vanished into thin air? Did fictional characters sometimes just disappear? Claire shot me another furious, accusatory glare. Mark, if you are playing some kind of twisted game. Suddenly, I thought I heard a faint, almost imperceptible noise, a low groan perhaps. Before Claire could finish her threat, I instinctively bolted towards the closed bathroom door. Pushing it open without knocking, I found Daniel slumped unceremoniously on the tiled floor right next to the toilet, clearly unconscious and reeking strongly of stale alcohol. Claire gasped and rushed past me, immediately kneeling beside him, frantically patting his face and calling his name. Daniel! Daniel, wake up! What happened? Slowly, groggily, Daniel's eyelids fluttered open. He blinked a few times, trying to focus. Claire? He mumbled, his voice thick and slurred. What are you doing here? We were supposed to have lunch together an hour ago, Claire reminded him, her voice tight with a mixture of overwhelming relief and simmering frustration. Did you completely forget? Daniel struggled to push himself into a sitting position, wincing. Oh, right, lunch. I forgot, sorry. I guess I had a bit too much to drink last night, celebrating with some friends. I looked pointedly at Claire's two bodyguards, who were now standing awkwardly in the bathroom doorway, observing the scene. Didn't either of you think to check the bathroom when you couldn't find him? I asked incredulously. One of the guards lowered his head slightly, looking sheepish. We didn't think Mr. Daniel would be in the bathroom, sir. It didn't seem likely. True enough, I supposed. Most people don't choose the floor next to the toilet as a preferred spot for sleeping off a hangover. It was a rather unique habit. Claire turned her frustration on her security team. You're all completely useless, she snapped irritably. I couldn't help but roll my eyes again, though I made sure she didn't see. For someone portrayed in the novel as a brilliant and ruthless businesswoman, her tendency to jump to conclusions based on past assumptions rather than actual evidence seemed remarkably unintelligent. Look, my dear former fiancé, I said, deliberately emphasizing the former with a touch of weariness. Maybe next time try to gather some actual facts before immediately pointing fingers and accusing me, okay? Don't just automatically blame me for everything that goes wrong in your orbit. After all the unnecessary drama and accusations, it turned out to be nothing more than a simple case of excessive drinking, leading to an inconvenient nap. This time, however, I was the one left feeling unjustly targeted and rather foolish. Before Claire could formulate a retort, Daniel, now slightly more alert, chimed in defensively. Well, perhaps if you hadn't actually had me kidnapped that other time, Claire wouldn't be so quick to suspect you now. I was so exasperated I almost laughed out loud. Right, my mistake, I conceded with heavy sarcasm. But seriously, Daniel, next time you decide to pass out beside the porcelain throne, maybe shoot us a quick text beforehand, just to avoid any unnecessary panic? You, Daniel started, clearly offended by my mocking tone. I couldn't be bothered engaging with him further. I turned my attention back to Claire, my patience wearing thin. Can we please go now? I urged, gesturing towards the door. No more delays. I have a significant amount of alimony waiting to be collected. Finally, after the frustrating delay and the unnecessary drama with Daniel's drunken disappearance, the day arrived when we could legally finalize the divorce. We returned to the Civil Affairs Bureau, which seemed considerably more crowded this time around. We had to take a number and wait in line for what felt like an eternity, the anticipation making the minutes crawl by. But eventually, our number was called. We were ushered back into the small office, signed the final documents under the official's watchful eye, and received our respective copies of the divorce certificate. It was done. Officially, irrevocably done. The substantial monetary transfer and the handover of the property deeds were processed shortly thereafter, confirmed via notifications on my phone. An incredible, almost physical wave of relief and pure, unadulterated happiness washed over me. Yes, freedom, coupled with immense fortune, was finally mine. From this moment forward, I vowed I was going to live the good life, savor every single moment, enjoy delicious food, travel, and generally relish this unexpected, fortunate peak in my existence. As we walked out of the bureau, Claire happened to notice the broad, irrepressible smile I simply couldn't wipe off my face. "Mark?" she asked, a hint of lingering confusion or perhaps curiosity in her voice. "What exactly are you smiling about?" After everything the original Mark had endured, and now finally achieving not just freedom but incredible wealth, why wouldn't I be ecstatic? But attempting to explain the complex layers of my situation. The transmigration, the foreknowledge from the novel, the contrast with my previous life, felt utterly pointless and unnecessarily complicated. I just shrugged casually, dialing back my overt happiness slightly. "Oh, nothing important," I replied vaguely. "Just relieved it's all settled. I should get going now." That very same day, I wasted no time in moving out of the vast, echoing, and ultimately lonely estate that Claire and Mark had shared. I settled into a spacious, modern, and comfortably appointed apartment I'd selected in a vibrant part of the city center. It wasn't nearly as grand or ostentatious as the Stone family estate, but it felt welcoming and perfectly suited for just me. I promptly hired a property management company to handle the renting out of the other 9 properties Claire had transferred to me, setting up a steady stream of passive income. Predictably, the Green family, Mark's somewhat estranged adoptive family, was extremely displeased when news of the finalized divorce reached them. They called repeatedly, urging me, sometimes even demanding, that I go back to Claire, apologize, and beg for reconciliation. In their narrow view, Mark's primary value lay in his connection, however tenuous, to the powerful and influential Stone family. Their pleas fell on deaf ears. I completely ignored their calls and eventually blocked all their numbers. Seriously, if anyone else wanted to step into the role of the pitiful, discarded, cannon fodder male supporting character, they were more than welcome to it. My aspirations were far simpler. Enjoy my newfound freedom and the considerable wealth that came with it. That evening, determined to celebrate my official liberation properly, I decided to visit a trendy, upscale bar located downtown. Life, as I now keenly felt, was indeed short and unpredictable. Might as well enjoy the good moments while they lasted, After indulging in only a couple of expensive cocktails, savoring the taste of high-quality liquor I could never have afforded before, I unexpectedly bumped into Sarah White again. "Mark?" she exclaimed, her eyes widening in genuine surprise. "You're actually here at a bar, drinking?" Her astonishment wasn't entirely unwarranted. According to the novel's background details and her earlier reaction, the original Mark apparently steered clear of such establishments, likely due to his singular focus on Claire, or perhaps because of his past negative experience with drinking. I grinned, feeling buoyant and carefree, and theatrically pulled the folded official divorce certificate from my inner jacket pocket, flourishing it slightly. "I am officially, completely, irrevocably divorced as of this afternoon," I declared with a touch of dramatic flair. "Don't you think I deserve a little celebration?" Sarah glanced briefly at the certificate. Then a warm, understanding smile spread across her face. "Well, in that definite case," she said, her tone becoming playful, "how about I keep you company for a few celebratory drinks?" I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice conspiratorially and smirking. "How about you buy me a drink to commemorate my newfound bachelorhood?" I knew from the novel that the White family, Sarah's family, was incredibly wealthy, perhaps even rivaling the Stones in certain sectors. Sarah, as their only child, undoubtedly possessed substantial personal wealth. Allowing her the pleasure of treating me seemed like a mutually beneficial arrangement. She got to perform a gesture of friendship, and I got free, top-shelf drinks. Sarah readily agreed and sat down across from me at a small table. Resting her chin elegantly on her hand, she studied me thoughtfully for a moment. "Claire isn't exactly known for her generosity of spirit," she remarked conversationally. "But I imagine she wasn't stingy when it came to the alimony settlement, given the circumstances and her family's reputation." I chuckled, taking a sip of the drink she'd ordered for me. "Definitely need to manage it wisely," I quipped, deciding to play along with a persona. "Got to start saving up, you know. Might need funds for the next wife, whenever she comes along." Sarah raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, her expression hinting at amusement. "Already thinking about remarrying? So soon after this divorce?" I shrugged nonchalantly, conveying an air of sophisticated indifference. "What else is a man supposed to do? Swear off relationships entirely just because one marriage didn't work out, especially when it ended like this? No way. Claire is firmly in the past now. History?" I wasn't sure which specific part of my response resonated with her. Perhaps the clear dismissal of Claire. But Sarah's smile widened, and she immediately, generously offered to cover my entire bar tab for the rest of the night. Overjoyed by this unexpected boon, I wasted no time in signaling the bartender and ordering one of the most expensive vintage wines listed on their menu. If she was paying, I might as well enjoy the best. The next morning, I awoke with a dull throbbing in my head, sunlight streaming insistently through a gap in the heavy hotel room curtains. My first sensation was confusion. This definitely wasn't my apartment. Rolling over slowly, my eyes landed on Sarah, sleeping peacefully in the adjacent twin bed. A jolt of panic shot through me. What had happened last night? Had I quickly did a mental inventory and a discreet physical check. Thankfully, it seemed my virtue remained intact. My clothes were still on, though significantly rumpled, and there were 2 distinct beds in the room. It appeared nothing inappropriate had transpired between us. Just as relief began to wash over me, Sarah stirred and opened her eyes. She blinked a few times, then glanced over at me and groaned softly. "Honestly, Mark, if you're going to celebrate that hard, you really need to learn your drinking limits," she complained, stretching languidly like a cat. "You are ridiculously heavy. Getting you up here last night nearly broke my back." It transpired that I had indeed gotten thoroughly intoxicated celebrating my divorce. Sarah, demonstrating remarkable practicality and kindness, had decided it was easier to bring me to a nearby luxury hotel rather than attempt to navigate getting me all the way back to my new apartment in my inebriated state. Concerned that I might get sick during the night, she had booked a room with 2 beds and stayed, falling asleep herself while keeping a watchful eye on me. Looking at her now, slightly tousled from sleep but clearly having acted out of genuine concern for my well-being, I couldn't help but contrast her actions with Claire's known behavior. A specific incident from the novel came to mind. The time the original Mark had gotten drunk and argued with Claire, resulting in her furiously ordering her bodyguards to physically throw him out of their house, leaving him to spend a miserable night shivering on the cold, damp lawn. That humiliating experience had supposedly prompted Mark to swear off alcohol entirely. Sarah, it seemed, was a far more reliable and compassionate person than Claire had ever been. After we both managed to get ourselves showered and presentable, Sarah and I proceeded down to the lobby to check out. As we stepped out of the hotel's revolving doors onto the busy sidewalk, my eyes unexpectedly landed on a familiar figure standing not far away. It was Claire. Standing close beside her, looking impeccably dressed in a tailored business suit, was Daniel. This particular hotel, I recalled, was one of the flagship properties owned by the Stone Group, Claire's family conglomerate. She was most likely here for a business meeting, or perhaps escorting an important client. Sarah, noticing them almost simultaneously, gave me a subtle nudge and tilted her head discreetly in their direction. I just shrugged, affecting an air of complete indifference. "A qualified ex-spouse," I muttered under my breath, mostly for Sarah's benefit. "Should ideally behave as if they are deceased. No need to acknowledge her presence or go over and exchange awkward pleasantries." Seriously, as a character who was supposed to be merely supporting cast in their grand, dramatic romance, maintaining a healthy distance seemed like the wisest and safest strategy for my own peace of mind. Claire's gaze, however, drifted towards us and lingered for several seconds, her expression unreadable from this distance. Then, she turned and murmured something to Daniel. His posture seemed to stiffen slightly, but he nodded, turned, and got into a waiting chauffeured car by himself, which promptly drove away. Claire then pivoted and began walking purposefully towards Sarah and me, her face set in an expression that clearly indicated displeasure, perhaps even anger. "Mark," she said as she reached us, her voice tight and serious, lacking any social niceties. "I need to talk to you for a minute, alone." Before I could even formulate a response, Sarah intervened smoothly, demonstrating impressive social awareness. "I'll just wait for you in the car, Mark," she said, giving me a quick, reassuring glance before turning and walking gracefully towards the nearby parking garage. I turned back to face Claire, bracing myself. "What's up, Claire?" I asked, aiming for a neutral, slightly weary tone. She fixed me with a piercing, demanding stare. "What, exactly," she asked, her voice sharp, "is your relationship with Sarah White?" A flash of hot irritation surged through me. We were legally divorced. My personal relationships were absolutely none of her business. What right did she have to question me? "Whatever you imagine it is," I replied lazily, deliberately refusing to give her a straight answer. "That's probably what it is." "Perhaps." Sensing the significant shift in my attitude, the complete lack of deference or lingering attachment that the original Mark would have displayed, Claire's stern expression faltered slightly. She bit her lower lip, a flicker of something uncertain in her eyes. "Mark," she said, her voice suddenly softer, almost hesitant. I'm not actually pregnant." "Not pregnant?" The revelation hit me. So, Daniel had lied about it. It must have been a calculated tactic, likely designed to pressure her family, especially her formidable father, into accepting their relationship and consenting to our divorce more readily. But honestly, did this revelation really change anything fundamental? Pregnant or not, Claire's heart clearly belonged to Daniel. She had chosen him unequivocally. Her lack of pregnancy didn't alter the core dynamics of the situation, nor did it affect my plans in any way. "Oh," I said, processing the information with deliberate casualness. "Well, in that case, I suppose you should focus your efforts on trying to get pregnant with Daniel's child for real then. Shouldn't you?" Claire froze completely, staring at me as if I'd slapped her, utter disbelief washing over her features. What did you just say?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I couldn't help but feel a small, cynical chuckle rise internally at her shocked reaction. Here I was, being the supposedly magnanimous ex-husband, effectively giving her my blessing to pursue her happiness with the man she loved, and she still seemed taken aback, almost offended. "I'm simply wishing you both the very best," I clarified, maintaining my carefully cultivated air of nonchalance. "You always wanted to be with Daniel, didn't you? Well, now you finally have your chance, unencumbered. Go for it." Claire fell silent, seemingly rendered speechless by my unexpected response, her expression a confusing mix of emotions. Assuming the conversation had reached its conclusion, I started to turn away, intending to join Sarah. But she stopped me again, her voice quiet but insistent. "Mark." I turned back, letting my impatience show more clearly this time. "Is there something else, Claire?" I asked, my tone bordering on irritation. Claire looked at me strangely, her gaze searching my face as if trying to decipher a difficult puzzle. I can drive you home," she offered unexpectedly, her voice still subdued. I waved a dismissive hand towards the parking garage where Sarah had gone. "No need," I stated firmly, making my preference clear. "Sarah's giving me a ride." Without waiting for any further response or argument, I turned decisively and walked away at a brisk pace, leaving her standing alone on the sidewalk. As I got into the passenger seat of Sarah's comfortable car, I glanced back reflexively through the rear window. Claire was still standing there, motionless, watching us leave, looking strangely solitary against the backdrop of the bustling city street. Once we were pulling out of the garage, Sarah shot me a curious, sideways look. "You're not still harboring some lingering feelings for Claire, are you, Mark?" she asked, a hint of teasing challenge in her voice. "Don't be utterly ridiculous," I scoffed immediately, perhaps a little too defensively. Then, seeking to definitively change the subject and perhaps lighten the slightly tense mood, I peered intently out the window at the pedestrians. "Hey, quick," I said, rubbing my eyes theatrically. "Help me out here. Is that woman over there in the short skirt attractive? My vision's still a bit blurry from last night's celebration." Sarah just rolled her eyes good-naturedly at my rather obvious attempt to divert her attention. "Wow," she commented dryly, a hint of amusement in her voice. "I almost thought for a fleeting second back there that you might actually still be pining for Claire after all. Turns out you've already fully transitioned to scoping out other women on the street." I would have to be certifiably insane, completely out of my mind, to still harbor any feelings for Claire, I retorted with genuine conviction. "Honestly, Sarah, she feels like nothing but bad luck wrapped in an expensive package. Maybe the original Mark really did meet his unfortunate end, partly because of her convoluted drama, and somehow that created the vacancy for me to end up here." Sarah couldn't help but laugh aloud at my somewhat morbid speculation. Watching her laugh, her face lighting up, I had the distinct thought that she looked genuinely, effortlessly pretty when she smiled like that. The following few weeks unfolded in a pleasant, almost dreamlike state of leisure and indulgence. I even treated myself to a spontaneous 2-week international vacation, exploring fascinating cultures and stunning landscapes I'd only ever read about before. The experience solidified my newfound appreciation for wealth. The sheer, unadulterated luxury of having absolutely nothing pressing to do but relax, explore, and enjoy life was intoxicatingly comfortable. I finally understood why so many people dedicated their lives to chasing riches. Soon after I returned from my travels, tanned and relaxed, Sarah came over to visit my apartment, bringing with her not just pleasant company but also some intriguing pieces of gossip circulating within their elite social circles. Apparently, the story about Daniel's past had emerged. He had indeed been married before, to a significantly older, very wealthy woman living abroad. However, their marriage reportedly ended when his affluent wife found herself a younger, more handsome replacement, and subsequently dumped Daniel rather unceremoniously. It was only after this bruising divorce and reported financial setback that Daniel had returned to the country and actively sought out Claire again, presumably seeing her as a desirable and financially secure prospect. No wonder he had reacted so defensively and strangely when I had casually joked about him never having been divorced before. The topic was clearly a sore spot. According to Sarah's sources, Claire was absolutely furious when she eventually discovered that Daniel had deliberately concealed his previous marriage from her. They'd apparently had a massive, explosive argument over his deception. It was during this heated confrontation, Sarah relayed, that Claire somehow lost her footing, accidentally tumbled down a flight of stairs, and consequently ended up injured and admitted to the hospital. At this juncture in her narrative, Sarah paused and looked at me pointedly, her expression carefully neutral. "So," she suggested, perhaps subtly testing my reaction again, "if you were perhaps entertaining any thoughts about rekindling things with her, now would probably be the opportune moment. She's laid up in the hospital, likely feeling vulnerable and alone." Sarah, knowing the depth of the original Mark's decade-long obsession, probably still harbored some suspicion that residual feelings might linger within me, despite my recent pronouncements. I just scoffed dismissively at the suggestion. "Are you actually kidding me, Sarah?" I responded incredulously. "I intend to live a long, happy, and preferably drama-free life. Getting entangled with Claire and her chaotic orbit again sounds like the fastest way to shorten it considerably. No thank you." As if summoned by the mere mention of her name, my phone began to ring at that precise moment. A quick glance at the caller ID confirmed it was Claire. I hesitated for only a second, then decided to answer, steeling myself. "Hello?" Claire's voice sounded noticeably weak and hoarse through the phone line. "Mark, I'm in the hospital." Why should that be my concern? We were divorced. I wasn't her emergency contact or her caretaker anymore. Still, basic human decency required some acknowledgement. "Oh," I replied, deliberately keeping my tone non-committal and unemotional. "Well, I hope you feel better soon. Take care of yourself." There was a brief pause on her end. Then she asked, her voice laced with a fragile, almost childlike vulnerability that felt strangely out of character. "Mark, aren't you coming to visit me?" That's when the pieces clicked into place. I suddenly recalled a specific anecdote from the novel detailing an incident years prior when Claire had been involved in a serious car accident. The original. Mark, utterly devoted, had apparently rushed to her side immediately, staying by her hospital bed practically around the clock, tending to her needs more diligently than any paid nurse. Yet even during that period of intense care, she had reportedly treated him with characteristic coolness and detachment. Now, finding herself injured and hospitalized once more, she was calling me, the man inhabiting Mark's body, clearly expecting, or at least hoping for, a repeat performance of that same selfless devotion. Absolutely not a chance. "We're divorced, Claire," I stated plainly, ensuring my voice was firm and unambiguous, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "Legally, completely divorced. There's absolutely no reason for us to maintain contact, and I certainly won't be visiting you in the hospital. You have Daniel, your family, your staff. I'm sure you'll be well taken care of. If there's nothing else of actual importance, I need to hang up now." After ending the call with a decisive click, I tossed the phone onto the sofa and noticed Sarah watching me with an unreadable, contemplative expression. Suddenly, I remembered the casual promise I'd made to her earlier. "Hey," I said, deliberately shifting the mood and topic. "I think I mentioned before that I owed you a proper meal sometime, right? To thank you for dealing with my drunken state the other night." I had just said it offhandedly back then, not really expecting her to recall it. "How about this?" I proposed, struck by a sudden idea that also appealed to my increasingly budget-conscious side. Despite my wealth, old habits died hard. "I'll run out right now and grab some groceries, and we can just eat here at my place. I can cook something up." Mostly, I suggested it to avoid the potential expense of taking someone like Sarah to a restaurant befitting her status, which could easily run into thousands. Sarah raised an elegant eyebrow, looking genuinely surprised. "You can cook?" she asked skeptically. The original Mark, according to all accounts, was utterly useless in the kitchen, but I possessed decent culinary skills honed from years of necessity in my previous life. "It's not that difficult," I assured her confidently. "You just relax here. I'm heading to the gourmet market right now to get the best ingredients, and I promise to whip up a feast that will impress you." 2 hours later, Sarah was seated at my dining table, looking genuinely delighted and giving me an enthusiastic thumbs up between mouthfuls. "Wow, Mark, seriously, this is incredible," she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling. "The flavors are amazing. You're honestly almost as good as a professional chef." She picked up her chopsticks again and eagerly took another bite, continuing to shower my cooking with effusive praise as she ate. Hearing such high compliments from a wealthy young woman presumably accustomed to dining at the world's finest establishments, all for my relatively simple, home-cooked meal, felt unexpectedly and deeply satisfying. Seeing her genuine enjoyment brought me a quiet sense of accomplishment. As we continued eating and chatting comfortably, I inadvertently fumbled and dropped one of my chopsticks, which clattered onto the polished surface of the table. Instinctively, both Sarah and I reached for it at the exact same moment. Our fingers brushed. A brief, unexpected contact that sent a surprising jolt like static electricity through me. We both froze instantly, pulling our hands back slightly, our eyes meeting across the table. A becoming blush immediately spread across Sarah's cheeks, betraying her sudden shyness or surprise. She started to withdraw her hand completely, but acting on a sudden impulse I didn't fully understand, I gently caught her fingers, holding her hand lightly in mine. "Sarah," I said softly, her name sounding different, more significant on my lips this time. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with surprise, her blush deepening slightly. Honestly, my own heart suddenly started pounding in my chest, a rapid, unfamiliar rhythm, especially under the intensity of her surprised gaze. In that moment, comparing her quiet warmth and genuine reactions to Claire's habitual cool aloofness, I felt a strong, undeniable preference for Sarah. She might project an image of confidence, even headstrong arrogance at times, but underneath, she felt real, vulnerable, and incredibly feminine. Still, despite my newfound wealth and confidence, I was, in reality, just a guy with virtually zero actual romantic experience. Holding my breath, feeling both nervous and inexplicably bold, I leaned in across the table and gently pressed my lips to her cheek in a soft, hesitant kiss. Sarah's eyes widened even further, her lips parting slightly as if to speak. "You," she started to say, her voice breathless. But before she could finish her sentence, the sharp, insistent ringing of my apartment doorbell shattered the fragile intimacy of the moment. Annoyed by the ill-timed interruption, I reluctantly released her hand and got up to answer it. Standing outside my door, looking even paler and more frail than she had sounded on the phone, was Claire. She had clearly lost more weight, and her face looked drawn and tired beneath the stark white bandage wrapped around her head. She presented a picture of tragic, broken beauty, looking utterly pitiful and vulnerable. I couldn't help but shake my head inwardly, a little impatiently. Was it really just a breakup with Daniel that had reduced her to this state? Did she have to completely fall apart over him? She seemed like the type who might develop an unhealthy, obsessive dependency in her relationships. Her voice choked with emotion as she spoke, tears already glistening in her eyes. "I went back. I looked at that sketchbook, Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The one you gave me all those years ago. All those drawings. I finally went through them properly. And now I understand. I finally understand how much you truly loved me. I'm so sorry, Mark. I was wrong. Terribly wrong about everything. Can you ever find it in your heart to forgive me?" It was true. The sheer volume and dedication evident in the sketchbook provided undeniable, heartbreaking proof of the original Mark's profound and enduring love for her. When I didn't respond immediately, stunned by her sudden appearance and confession, she began to cry openly, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Mark, I truly regret it," Claire sobbed, her voice cracking with emotion, making no attempt to hide her distress. "I never should have divorced you. These past few weeks, they've been terrible. I've missed you so much, more than I ever thought possible. Can you please just come back to me? We can try again." If the original Mark, the man whose body I now occupied, had been present to witness this scene, Claire, the woman he had worshipped from afar for over a decade, finally acknowledging his love, crying, begging for him. His heart surely would have shattered and then soared with hope. He would have forgiven her instantly, embraced her without hesitation. But I wasn't Mark. Her tears, whether born of genuine regret, loneliness, or simply the emotional fallout from her disastrous relationship with Daniel, left me completely unmoved on a personal level. "Claire," I said firmly, meeting her tear-filled gaze without flinching, needing to be absolutely clear. "There's no magic regret pill you can take to undo the past. What's done is done. We finalized the divorce. It's over between us." Panic immediately flashed across her face, widening her already large eyes. "No, I don't believe you," she stammered, shaking her head vehemently. "You can't mean that. I know you still do." Before she could finish her desperate sentence, Sarah emerged from the dining area, perhaps drawn by the sound of voices, and walked smoothly up to stand beside me. With a casual, possessive air, she wrapped an arm around my waist, leaning her head slightly against my shoulder. "Mark," she said, her voice bright and cheerful, deliberately ignoring Claire's presence and distress. "Those roasted ribs you made earlier were absolutely divine. You have to give me the recipe sometime." I smiled down at her, genuinely grateful for her timely intervention and implicit support. "I'm glad you enjoyed them," I replied warmly, placing my arm around her shoulders. Sarah then glanced pointedly towards Claire, who stood frozen by the doorway as if turned to stone, and let out a small, almost imperceptible giggle that held a sharp edge of mockery. "My goodness, Miss Stone," she remarked lightly, her tone dripping with faux innocence. "A guest arrives at the door looking rather unwell, and you don't even think to invite her in to sit down? How inhospitable." Claire's already pale face turned a ghastly ashen shade. She shot me one final, deeply wounded look, filled with betrayal and incomprehension, before turning abruptly and fleeing down the apartment building corridor, her footsteps echoing hollowly. Watching her retreating figure, I couldn't suppress a fleeting, almost clinical thought. Wow, the powerful female lead from the novel has certainly experienced a significant fall from grace. Life, it seemed, truly did have a strange and unpredictable way of flipping the script. Just as the sound of her footsteps faded, Sarah gave my waist another playful, perhaps slightly proprietary, pinch, pouting up at me. "What was that lingering look on your face just now?" she asked, her tone shifting back to the personal, her eyes searching mine. "And don't think I've forgotten, you kissed me just before she arrived. Are you seriously planning on backing out now?" Snapping my attention fully back to her, back to the present moment, I gently reached up and brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead, then patted her head softly. "What are you even talking about?" I said softly, meeting her gaze directly. "If anything, knowing my luck, I'm far more worried that you'll eventually get bored and dump me, not the other way around." Sarah's face instantly flushed a brilliant, becoming shade of red at my words. Before I quite registered her intention, she threw her arms around my neck impulsively, burying her face against my chest in a gesture that felt both shy and incredibly trusting. I instinctively wrapped my arms around her waist, holding her tightly against me. Honestly, she felt soft and warm and real in my embrace, and holding her close like this felt unexpectedly right, incredibly comforting in a way I hadn't anticipated. In the days and weeks following that dramatic evening, my relationship with Sarah blossomed naturally and quickly. It felt easy, comfortable, and refreshingly free of the complex baggage and power dynamics that had defined Mark's marriage to Claire. Soon after we officially acknowledged ourselves as a couple, Sarah insisted on taking me to meet her parents. Knowing from our previous conversation that her father had a heart condition, I made sure to arrive bearing thoughtful gifts, some high-quality, doctor-approved health supplements, and a rare blend of calming tea. Thankfully, Mr. and Mrs. White turned out to be warm, welcoming, and surprisingly down-to-earth, despite their immense wealth. They seemed genuinely pleased to meet me, and, more importantly, happy to see Sarah looking so content. They didn't seem overly concerned about my recent divorce, perhaps understanding the nature of Mark's arranged marriage to Claire, and even remarked, with gentle teasing towards Sarah, that she wasn't getting any younger, and asked if we had discussed any future plans, including marriage. Holding Sarah's hand securely in mine under the table, I looked across at her smiling parents and answered with a confidence that surprised even myself. "Actually, yes, we're planning on getting married next month." Her mom and dad beamed simultaneously, their delight palpable, repeating how wonderful that news was. We continued chatting pleasantly for a while longer before her parents tactfully excused themselves, heading upstairs and leaving Sarah and me alone in their elegantly appointed living room. As soon as they were out of earshot, Sarah turned to me, a mixture of surprise and questioning in her eyes. "You told my parents we're getting married next month?" she began, sounding slightly breathless and perhaps a little overwhelmed. "But we haven't even really talked about—" Her words trailed off abruptly as her gaze dropped, snagging on my left hand, specifically on the large, impossibly sparkling diamond ring I was now conspicuously wearing on my pinky finger, having slipped it on while her parents were saying their goodnights. I had, in fact, purchased the ring several days earlier, before we even planned the visit to her parents' house. A certainty had settled within me. I didn't want to risk losing Sarah. Marrying her, cementing our connection sooner rather than later, felt like the absolute right path forward for me. Looking directly into her wide, surprised eyes, I slid the ring off my finger, took her left hand in mine, and asked with all the sincerity I possessed, "Sarah White, will you marry me?" The diamond was substantial. A stunning 10 carats, undeniably flashy, perhaps even bordering on ostentatious. I might have retained some frugal habits from my previous life, but when it came to committing to the woman I now realized I genuinely loved and wanted to build a future with, I wasn't going to be stingy or hesitant. Sarah was so moved, so completely taken aback, that tears immediately sprang to her eyes. Happy tears this time. I smiled gently, instinctively reaching up to wipe away a tear that escaped and traced a path down her cheek. But she playfully slapped my hand away, her voice thick with emotion but also urgency. I blinked, momentarily taken aback by her reaction, until I heard her say through her joyful tears, "Stop wiping my tears! Just hurry up and put the ring on my finger before I change my mind. Or you do?" I laughed aloud then, relieved and charmed by her reaction. She was worried I might have second thoughts? Not a chance. With a steady hand, I carefully slid the magnificent diamond ring onto her fourth finger, where it seemed to instantly belong. Sarah let out an excited, happy squeal and threw her arms around my neck again, hugging me with exuberant force. I held her back just as tightly, feeling an overwhelming sense of joy and rightness about the decision. With the wedding unexpectedly set for the following month, the subsequent weeks became a whirlwind of somewhat rushed but exciting preparations. There were venues to book, guest lists to finalize, mostly handled by Sarah and her mother, thankfully, caterers to sample, and countless other details to arrange. One sunny morning, I accompanied Sarah to a high-end, exclusive bridal boutique to help her choose her wedding dress, or rather, to offer my admiring opinion once she had narrowed down the choices. After she selected a breathtaking gown, she disappeared into the spacious fitting room area with a consultant to try it on for alterations, leaving me to wait on a plush velvet sofa in the opulent main viewing salon. As I sat there, idly scrolling through news headlines on my phone and trying to look patient, I suddenly felt that prickling sensation of being watched. Looking up instinctively, my gaze met the familiar, sad eyes of Claire, standing just a short distance away, partially obscured by a mannequin draped in lace. She walked towards me slowly, her movements lacking their usual confident energy, her expression somber. Are you truly going through with it? Marrying Sarah?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, keeping my expression carefully neutral, not wanting to cause a scene or give her false hope. "Yes," I confirmed simply. "We've already set the date. It's next month." A wave of profound sadness washed over Claire's already pale features. "Can't you? Please, Mark. Can't you reconsider? Don't marry her," she pleaded softly, her eyes welling up with fresh tears. Claire," I interrupted, keeping my voice gentle but firm, needing her to understand the finality of the situation. "Let's be brutally honest here, for both our sakes. You don't actually love me. You might think you do right now, in the aftermath of Daniel's deceit and your own regrets, but it's not love. It's likely just possessiveness, a reaction to seeing me happy and moving on with someone else. If you hadn't discovered that Daniel lied to you about his past, you wouldn't have given me a second thought." Claire immediately started shaking her head, denying my assessment through her falling tears. No, that's not true," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "I admit, I always thought I loved Daniel, that he was the one. But after the divorce, everything fell apart, And I realized I'd made a monumental mistake letting you go. I regretted it almost immediately. I can't let you go now, Mark. I love you. I know I do. I glanced anxiously towards the fitting room doors, acutely aware that Sarah could emerge at any moment. I didn't want her joyous experience of trying on her wedding dress to be tainted by Claire's emotional outburst. Even if you genuinely believe you regret it now, Claire, I said bluntly, deciding that directness was the kindest approach in the long run, it honestly doesn't change anything for me. Your regret, unfortunately, has nothing to do with me or my future. The only person I want to be with now, the only person I want to build a life with, is Sarah. Claire's tears fell even faster at my unequivocal words, silent drops tracing paths down her cheeks. I pressed on, needing to extinguish any lingering spark of hope she might be clinging to. Look at me, Claire, I urged softly. Look at your tears. Seeing you cry like this. Honestly, I don't feel anything. No residual affection, no pity, not even much irritation anymore. Don't you understand what that means? It means I don't love you anymore. Whatever feelings the original Mark had, they're gone. Claire froze completely, her tear-filled eyes fixed on mine, absorbing the harsh truth of my words. She bit her lower lip hard, seemingly trying to stifle a sob or hold back a further plea. After a long, fraught moment of silence, she simply turned around, her shoulders slumped in defeat, and walked silently away, disappearing back into the boutique's depths. Through the large, ornate window at the front of the salon, I noticed that sometime during our conversation, it had started to rain heavily outside, sheets of water slanting down from a gray sky. A moment later, I saw Claire exit the boutique onto the street. She didn't have an umbrella. She just walked out directly into the downpour, letting the heavy rain soak her hair and clothes within seconds. She looked utterly disheveled, small, and profoundly miserable as she trudged away down the sidewalk. It was a stark, almost shocking contrast to the impeccably poised, powerful, unapproachable CEO image she had always projected. It was the first time I had ever seen her look truly, completely broken. But even witnessing her in such a state, I felt a strange emptiness, a lack of any emotional response. Just then, the fitting room door swished open, and Sarah stepped out onto the raised platform, wearing the magnificent wedding dress she had chosen. The sight quite literally stole my breath away. She looked absolutely, stunningly radiant, the embodiment of bridal beauty. "Sweetheart," I breathed, standing up and walking towards her, my previous encounter with Claire momentarily forgotten. "You look incredible, so incredibly beautiful, absolutely captivating." Sarah blushed becomingly under my intense gaze, a shy but happy smile gracing her lips. "You're just full of sweet talk today, aren't you?" she murmured playfully. I reached out, took her hands in mine, and pulled her gently into my arms, mindful of the delicate fabric of her gown. "I'm only telling the absolute truth," I whispered sincerely, looking down into her sparkling, happy eyes. In that precise moment, any lingering phantoms of the past, any residual echoes of Mark's old life or Claire's drama, vanished completely, replaced by a profound sense of certainty. Sarah was the woman I was meant to be with. This was my future. The wedding day arrived far quicker than I had anticipated, a blur of final preparations culminating in a beautiful, joy-filled ceremony. Both Sarah and I were practically buzzing with excitement and happiness throughout the day, exchanging vows, greeting guests, and celebrating with our friends and families. Afterwards, following the reception and adhering to tradition, I scooped Sarah up into my arms bridal style, intending to carry her triumphantly towards our waiting limousine, ready to embark on our honeymoon and our new life together. As I lifted her, laughing into my arms, out of the very corner of my eye. I thought I caught a fleeting glimpse of a solitary, slender figure, standing partially obscured by a large marble pillar some distance away across the venue's courtyard. Perhaps it was Claire, perhaps just a lingering guest. Honestly, in that moment, I didn't care enough to look closer or confirm the sighting. My entire focus, my entire world, was centered on the beautiful, beaming woman nestled securely in my arms, looking down at Sarah's radiant face, her eyes shining with love and happiness as she looked up at me. I smiled, my own heart filled to bursting with a profound sense of contentment and joy unlike anything I had ever experienced before, either in this life or the last. "Sweetheart," I murmured, leaning down to kiss her tenderly as the limousine door opened. This was my life now, and it felt absolutely perfect.